If you were closely observing 19th century presidential politics in the United States, there would be a handful of states that you would want to pay close attention to. You would want to look at these so-called swing states, states that would be super close by the end of election night and would often be too close to call. You might think these states would be the swing states of today, like Florida or Pennsylvania, but you'd be wrong. In fact, these states were once rock-solid Democratic and Republican states, respectively. Swing states are nothing new. They have always existed. However, not all swing states stay that way. Changes in demographics and economics changes the voting behaviors of certain constituencies. In this video, we are going to explore the swing states of the past with a particular focus on mid to late 19th century American politics. We're going to look at why these states were so marginal to begin with and why they changed as we come closer to the present. New York, from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century, was considered to be a quintessential swing state. That might seem like an impossibility in 2021, considering that no Republican has won the state in a presidential election since 1988. However, history paints a more complicated picture. New York, for most of its history, has been the largest state in the nation in terms of population. It has always boasted a dynamic and diversified economy, and as a result, a diverse voting base. The ancestors of both the modern-day Republican and Democratic parties have their births in the Empire State. Alexander Hamilton was a lifelong New Yorker, and his message of a strong national government to support an industrial nation appealed to New York financiers and businessmen. As a result, the Federalist Party prospered. At the same time, New York was the birthplace of Martin Van Buren, the founder of the Democratic Party. The antebellum Democratic Party spoke of small government and a lower tariff. This appealed to recent immigrants coming from autocratic and paternalistic states in Europe. Since New York was the largest port of entry for immigrants coming from Europe, immigrant communities played a large role in local politics. Many immigrants became part of a massive political machine known as Tammany Hall. Notoriously corrupt, Tammany Hall would provide employment and patronage opportunities to recent immigrants, and in return expected their loyalty when it came time to vote in local and national elections. The massive pool of immigrants coming into New York from Europe made Tammany Hall extremely powerful. Virtually all politicians in the state and in the city owed their debt of gratitude to Tammany and its cronies. During the Gilded Age, the affluent voters of New York tended to split their time between living in New York City and in their vast country estates that dominated the landscape of upstate New York. Even after the Federalist Party had collapsed, the philosophy of economic and nationalism continued to carry into the Whig and Republican parties. Along with support for a tariff and emancipation, Republican voters also tended to support the temperance movement. This culture clash between newly arrived Catholics and long-established Protestants made the state very competitive in elections. From 1860 to 1892, no party's candidate would win the state with more than 8 percentage points of a difference. In every single one of these elections, Democrats would manage to win a majority of votes in what was then called New York County, now part of Manhattan and the Bronx. This was, keep in mind, prior to consolidation. In 1864, Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln won the state of New York, but only by just 0.9% of the vote. This would be the closest win in the history of the state. The Democratic nominee, George B Mcclellan, managed to win out 50 to 60% of the votes in Manhattan and the Bronx. He also managed to win a majority of the votes in Erie County, where Buffalo is located. Lincoln, by contrast, managed to clean up upstate New York, but more importantly, he won over affluent to middle-class voters in the city who were sympathetic towards tariffs being raised and for emancipation for blacks. This set the stage for upstate New York to be a Republican bastion for the next 100 years. It wasn't until the election of 1896 that the Democrats turned their back on New York City with the election of William Jennings Bryan, whose political message of agrarian population isolated many voters and turned them to William McKinley. But they would return to the Democratic Party for the rest of the 20th century. And until the middle of that century, the state of New York remained hotly competitive. There were other swing states throughout the second half of the 19th century. California was another state that saw close elections. From 1868 to 1896, California had between 5 to 9 electoral votes, far cry from the 55 it sent to the Electoral College in the last election. The state at this point in time was still largely agrarian, but boasted several growing population centers, especially San Francisco and Sacramento. These small farmers, by and large, tended to vote for the Democratic Party. During this period, Democrats were strongest in the San Quin Valley, located in the middle of the state. Fresno County, right in the middle of this valley and right in the middle of the state, was the most Democratic county in this entire period. During this period, Fresno could carry up to 70% of the vote for Democrats. The Democrats, while a strong party in this state, never had the strength of the Republicans. The Republicans had their strongest support in the growing suburbs outside of San Francisco and Sacramento. The California Republican Party was formed in Sacramento, and from the beginning the local population was aligned to the Union. The citizens of Sacramento and the state by and large were opposed to slavery. The party was especially generous to the all-powerful and all-growing railroad tycoons whose trains crisscrossed the state. The investment in railroads brought plenty of wealth to the state, continuing the state's rise to prominence. The rise of the railroad companies during the Civil War made the state more connected and extremely rich. Nearby settlements such as Stockton remained Republican bastions well into the 20th century. Despite the Republicans often being accused of corruption and being in bed with the railroad companies, between 1864 and 1896, the state would vote Republican in every single election except for one in 1888. During these elections, the races were extremely close. The election of 1896, the election was particularly close. While still mostly a rural state at the time, William Jennings Bryan's message of agrarian population struck a chord. However, it scared suburban voters in San Francisco and Sacramento. Republican presidential candidate William McKinley ended up winning the state 49.1% to Bryan's 48.5%. This race was far closer than many of the other races held throughout the country in similar sized areas such as New York and Pennsylvania. All was not lost for Bryan, however, since one electoral college elector ended up voting for Bryan. However, the remaining 8 went to McKinley. Another swing state during the post-bellum period was the state of Indiana. The political geography of the state was a microcosm for the entire nation. The industrial northern half of the state tended to vote Republican, while the agrarian South tended to vote for Democrats. Many prominent politicians from both parties were from Indiana. Thomas Hendrickson, the Democratic VP for Cleveland, still today is fondly remembered, as is Republican President Benjamin Harrison, who was from a prominent family going all the way back to the beginning of the state. Political enthusiasm was high, with turnout in elections sometimes reaching as high as 90%. Party political machines had influence not just in Indianapolis and in other major centers, but virtually every county had its own Republican and Democratic boss. Accusations of fraud were widespread, and both sides accused the other of paying people to vote or not to vote, depending upon the circumstance. The state was also the battleground for the culture wars of the era. In particular, the temperance movement was very prevalent across the state. Anti-saloon leagues became widespread across the state. Protestant voters tended to support legislation regulating, if not totally banning, the sale of alcohol, while the growing Catholic population within the state resisted such moral crusading. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was one such organization that lobbied heavily for the prohibition of alcohol. Their efforts were so successful that a bill banning the sale of alcohol in the state reached the legislature until it was killed in the democratically controlled House of Representatives. Connecticut was another state that saw close elections during this period. Since the colonial period, Connecticut was a land known for its conservatism. As a colony, it was set up by the ultra-religious Protestants who preached a conservative form of evangelical Christianity. Religious revivals were common in the colonial period. The presence of Yale College, long associated with the New England aristocracy, made it a conservative hotspot. During the first and second party systems, the state was reliably aligned to the Federalists and then later Whigs. Within the state, the Federalist Party developed a vast and powerful network of party bosses and activists who worked full-time within the system to get the party elected to power. Connecticut was one of the last states to give up the Federalist Party, and the party remained active in the state while the majority of the nation abandoned the party. Naturally, the Republican Party followed suit in this tradition. The religiosity of the population lent its hand to the state abolishing slavery relatively early on and became a home for the ever-growing abolitionist movement. The party was benefited from the one town, one representative rule, which made rural voters more powerful than urban ones. Democrats, on the other hand, struggled in this state. As the cities, however, began to grow and Catholics began to move more and more into the urban areas, did the politics of the state begin to change. A sign of things to come came in 1876 when the Democratic candidate for president, Samuel Tilden, a New Yorker, defeated Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. This was, at the time, Hayes's signal that he had lost. However, it was the beginning of a long-term battle to eventually win the presidency, though he still lost the state of Connecticut.